The inspection of schools has been widespread in Europe since about 1800, yet it remains a controversial and emotional topic. This is the first in a series of videos which will look at how inspection developed and what we can learn for today about the issues of the past. My name is Adrian Gray. I have held senior roles within the School Inspectorate in England, Ofsted, and with the European group that brings together inspectorates from many different countries, the Standing International Conference of Inspectorates. I have also worked with a committee of the UK Parliament on the issue of school inspection, as well as a school improvement consultant. A few years ago, I found that very few people understood how school inspection had developed, including in Ofsted and other inspectorates. If we're going to have effective systems, we need to understand the successes and mistakes of the past. Inspection has been part of the education system across Europe for more than 200 years, much longer than any concepts of school leadership or self-evaluation. During that time, it has often been at the centre of political turmoil. Arguments have boiled over about several issues. Who should decide what counts as a good school? At one time, a school that did not use corporal punishment would have been criticised. Now, in many countries, it will get closed down. As time passed, other big questions included whether inspectors should be education experts or agents of government policy. Should inspectors check the political direction of a school and the content of its curriculum? Should they do the government's work or challenge its effectiveness? Some have argued that schools don't need inspecting, but this has never really been widely accepted since about 1850. Questions such as who checks the safety of the children and who decides if taxpayers' money is being spent wisely have always required someone to visit the school. Inspection as it is now has been formed by the debates of the past. We will also need to consider the question, what is an inspector? The word inspector has been used to mean very different things. In many countries, the inspector was actually a senior manager who visited the school and made decisions about it. They therefore had some responsibility for the school. Really, these people are more like line managers. In other countries, the inspectors were completely external to the school itself. They had no personal connection with the school and therefore were impartial, or should have been, to any local issues. Often they were agents of central government, whereas the schools were managed by some local government body. Another big question is how far schools should meet the same standards and what difference context should make. Here is a report from 150 years ago on a village school close to where I live, written by one of Her Majesty's inspectors of the time. This school is in a most unsatisfactory state. No one seems to have bestowed instruction on the children, arithmetic being almost unknown and spelling bad. Geography and grammar are not taught. There are many signs of neglect on the part of the master. Accounts and vouchers were not brought into the school. The children were untidy and the room dirty. Order and sewing are the only satisfactory points. What a shocking school, you might think. Well, the inspector was entirely uninterested in the situation of this school, concerned only whether it was providing an efficient education. In fact, the school had been through a terrible time. The last head teacher had seduced his young pupil teacher and then run off, abandoning both her and his own family. The head teacher before him had been arrested for attempting to murder a teacher in another school. An inspector who better understood the school's context might therefore have given a rather different perspective on how well the school was doing. But this was not the job of the government inspector that arrived. Sometimes people complain to me that inspectorates are always changing the criteria. In fact, I think this is good because standards and expectations vary over time. Do you think the school in this picture would be judged to be excellent today? Well, probably not. Well, in the early 1800s, beating children was common everywhere. An 1860 law case in England, though, established that reasonable chastisement of pupils was acceptable, but placed limits on what teachers could do. In Springthorpe, my favourite school, in 1900, a head teacher was taken to court for assaulting a pupil by beating them too much. Values were changing, and inspectors needed to adapt to the rules of the day and reflect what society believed. Corporal punishment was eventually banned in England in 1986, in all of Germany by 1990, but not finally banned in France until 2019. Inspectorates needed to reflect values such as these. The idea of inspection was not unique to schools. In fact, Catholic bishops had been meant to visit their diocese in medieval times, making a tour every 3 years, and even monasteries were subject to this form of inspection. In England, the Royal College of Physicians began to inspect London's madhouses, as they were called, from 1774. Their reports could be read by anyone thinking of placing a relative in one of the madhouses. One of the issues at that time was to prevent people being forcibly locked away by corrupt relatives and doctors, as shown in this old print, so there was an element of safeguarding to it as well. Soon, prisons also began to be inspected. This started from 1810 in Ireland and England and might include the work of any teacher working in the prison. This early example of report shows how inspectors looked at health, money, and whether regulations were being followed. First school inspection started in the 1600s. Inspection and line management often overlapped. It was more like supervision than independent inspection. So inspection was dominated by amateur clergy, often the parish priest, because the churches saw education as part of their domain, whether it was in Protestant Scotland or Catholic Austria. In Prussia, unpaid clergymen provided most of the inspectors from 1738, usually supervising their local school. At first, inspection was heavily focused on individual teacher performance, not school leadership, which was little understood. However, in some countries, it was more closely focused on whether taxpayers were getting value for money. By about 1850, many experts had concluded that inspection led to better schools. During the late 1700s Dutch Enlightenment, the belief grew that poverty was caused by moral failure, and the response was to provide education. In 1784, the Society for the Public Good formed and soon had branches in over 300 towns and villages, which typically set up primary schools funded by wealthy middle-class members. They picked up on the idea that the town of Haarlem had had in 1746, regulation and inspection of its schools. These became the model for the new national primary school system in 1806. The Dutch example provides evidence of debate over the who inspectors should be. The education laws of 1801 and 6 were drafted by academics Van der Palmer and Van der Ende. This helped create a model of what good schools should look like. They manifestly rejected the influence of what they called ignorant priestcraft. Inspectors by 1811 were men selected for their interest in education, experience of schools, and from professors at university. Inspection became a state matter, not a church one. The Dutch provide one of the first examples of an attempt to set out a framework for school evaluation, which then also helped guide schools in what they should be aiming for. This clearly reflected the values of the movement and the people of the time. Young children should be instructed in how to be civilized citizens, was one example. Another was people should feel they were all Dutchmen, citizens of the new kingdom. The framework promoted a common language, not regional dialect, and there was a heavy emphasis on moral development. It also defined what should be taught in ordinary schools: reading, writing, arithmetic, geometry, Dutch language, geography, history, vocal music and natural philosophy. Van der Palmer also suggested the how, and that should form part of the debate about excellence. The mode of instruction prevalent in the schools is servile and mechanical, he complained, adapted not to excite in the breast of the children a desire of learning, but to extinguish it, not to develop their mental powers, but to blunt them for the remainder of their lives, not to fill their memories with the knowledge of useful things, but with confused sounds. So we can see he clearly considered inspection could be used to drive forwards improvement in some of these apparently rather shocking schools that he was familiar with. Other countries also began school inspection. France from about 1809, Russia at about the same time, and the first government inspector was appointed in Ireland in 1820. Their role was to make sure that public tax money given to charity school boards was being used properly. It soon became clear that who the inspectors were was very important. The Dutch inspectors, as we've seen, were mainly experienced professionals or academics. The Dutch inspectors also held regular meetings, which helped inform the politicians about challenges and priorities. Informing government is an important role of an inspectorate. The French philosopher Victor Cousin studied all the education systems and decided that the Dutch was the best because of the impact of school inspection. His work on this was very influential internationally. Yet in Prussia, qualified teachers were inspected by unqualified parish priests, which cost nothing but reflected the power of the Roman Catholic Church especially. The same happened in Austria. In France, inspection was handed to the universities specifically to keep the influence of the church in its considered place. Belgium chose the Dutch model. They opted for professional inspectors on fixed contracts. The issue of who did the inspecting became a major battleground over the next few decades. The debate about who should be setting the standards at inspecting has raged back and forwards ever since. In France and Russia, systems focused on the excellence of the teacher. This led to the dominance of the universities and explicitly not the churches, as in this 1839 painting, though in Russia this pattern later declined. French university influence began with the secondary schools, but spread to primaries after, to quote, a state of languid degradation and death was detected there. In most of Europe, though, it was the churches who dominated inspection and thus defined excellence in Sweden, Scotland, Prussia, Austria and many others. King Ludwig of Bavaria distrusted highly educated teachers and placed them under amateur clerical inspectors instead in 1837. The debate about who was in control was emphasised when one of the first of the English Her Majesty's inspectors, Seymour Tremenhere, resigned after interference in his reports by politicians. He went on to become Inspector of Mines. Many systems focused on ensuring the competence of the teacher, not the excellence of the school. In some countries, inspectors became the gatekeepers to the teaching profession. Yet England lacked any regulation of teachers, which George Nichols was impressed by in Holland and Belgium. Nichols wrote that, in England, anyone could become a schoolmaster as easily as he can a coal merchant, by simply putting a brass plate on the door. Although this comment applied to private schools, there was also no regulation of teachers in general. As well as that, up to about 1850, the main focus was on defining minimum qualities and less on promoting excellence. This was especially so where regulatory laws set standards, but is what we might expect when public education was becoming established. Authoritarian countries like Russia had more interest in what was being taught. This became another important issue that inspection has struggled with. Some governments were more concerned about efficient use of public funds. From 1787 to 1808, Prussian schools were regulated by the Ministry of Finance. When public money began to be used to pay for schools, governments then wanted to inspect to ensure that it was being used efficiently, as in Ireland first and then England when the first Her Majesty's inspectors were created. This raised an important question. Was government-led inspection to operate only in government-funded schools, or should it operate in all schools, including expensive and famous private ones like Rugby School in this picture? This has been an issue throughout the history of inspection. Where governments decided to inspect privately funded schools, it was usually because there were concerns about safety or concerns about what was being taught. Charles Dickens's famous novel Nicholas Nickleby included some terrifying scenes based at what was actually a real school in northern England. Clearly, someone needed to check that children were safe, even if these schools were private. There were similar concerns in France, where most of the private schools were ardently Roman Catholic. This illustration shows a school started for peasant children in Russia. The Russian government was very interested in what was being taught in such schools. The need for consistent approaches by different inspectors meant that inspectorates began to develop operating guidelines, the genesis of the inspection handbook. It seems to have taken some time to understand that sharing this with schools might have helped the school improve themselves. Perhaps because the idea of school leadership was very limited, if not actually non-existent at that time. There was also no concept of self-evaluation. However, the Dutch inspectors soon began holding annual conferences to share their findings about what worked best. We can see from these early examples how the focus of inspection may have changed over time. Buildings and character were important in 1840 and not so much now, though attendance and methods of instruction have been a continuous focus. The French, like the Dutch, were starting to look at modes of instruction. But who decided what was good? In contrast, the Austrians were concentrating on whether schools met regulations. Questions of safety and law enforcement also arose. Prussia and England developed factory schools that needed to be inspected to ensure they met the law, for example, whether children were actually getting a few hours school a day. Thus the idea of a regulatory inspection developed further, not seeking to secure any improvement, but just to make sure children were not killed or exploited. In England, there were so few inspectors, only 2 in fact, that the factory owners knew where they were. So children could be dragged out of the mill and placed behind a desk just as the inspector arrived. Of course, the debate about inspection notice periods still around today. Welfare was also an issue in French boarding schools and in Ireland. But in England, private schools were not inspected, and they were some of the most abusive, as Dickens demonstrated. Part of the reason for French involvement in boarding schools was the conflict between the state and Catholicism. Whereas in Prussia from 1850, the king there had a political motivation too, but he wanted all schools to be regulated as part of his reaction against the revolutionary events of 1848. So these inspections raised deep issues. How far was it the state's job to involve itself in private businesses on behalf of children, and who should decide the boundaries? Well, in some countries, that argument is still going on. So by 1850, inspection was established in many countries, but it was also patchy. Often only schools that received some form of state funding were inspected. Conditions in the many forms of unregulated private schools could still be poor. A report on schools across Europe, published in 1851, noted that the schools under the government inspection are as a rule the only good schools in the country. There was a growing literature about the effectiveness of inspection, but this was less so where inspectors were local clergy rather than expert educators. The period after 1850 was a major era of nation building in Europe, especially new countries like Italy and Germany, and schools became a political tool. This was not new. You'll recall that Dutch culture was important in the first framework for the Netherlands, and something similar happened in Belgium. In Norway from 1889, the schools were expected to integrate the Sami people into the Norwegian mainstream. Countries also became more aware of education as a factor in being able to compete economically and militarily, which inspired the rise of technical schools. In Spain, attempts were made to regulate schools, teachers and the curriculum from the centre from 1857. This proved a long battle that was not resolved for decades. In some countries, the church was forced out of its leading role, for example in Prussia or as it became Germany, but in others it continued to dominate. Spain would be an example of that. Eventually, huge population increases and urbanisation helped force the church out of the inspectorate in Germany, Russia, Sweden and other countries. Despite all this, Bismarck in the new Germany had to lead the Kulturkampf, a struggle between state and church. The 1871 school inspection law in Germany never fully succeeded in breaking church influence until the early 1900s. Where the church did retain significant influence, the agenda might be idiosyncratic. In Malta, the physical posture of teachers was inspected in the 1870s. This issue of church and state was not resolved in Belgium until 1958. One issue to emerge was who controlled the agenda. In 1864 in England, the Minister of Education Robert Lowe was forced to resign after he was found out for altering the reports of Her Majesty's inspectors. They were meant to be independent of politicians. In other countries, inspectors were actually civil servants. They worked directly for the government. Between 1864 and 1871, inspector reports in Germany were suppressed after they began to criticise the wages of teachers. They argued that the reason teachers were so poor was because they were actually poor financially as well. Wages were too low. Government showed concern about the content of the curriculum. In Belgium, the state controlled textbooks from 1879, and inspectors were meant to enforce this level of control over what went on in the classroom. Robert Lowe was in charge of education in England at the time of one of the 19th century's most infamous school accountability systems. This was the payment by results system, which began in 1862. The simple idea was that schools and teachers would be paid according to the test results of their pupils, and this was meant to save money. However, it caused what is known as unintended consequences. Teachers neglected areas of the curriculum that were not tested and also focused all their attention on pupils at the test margin. The clever pupils and the weakest were neglected. This is an important idea in inspection. We cannot inspect everything, but when we make a choice on what to inspect, we risk schools ignoring other areas. However, the payment by results system was intended to make schools financially efficient, and it soon spread across the United Kingdom and into Australia. The inspector's job was simply to check if pupils met the standards. The poet Matthew Arnold, who was an inspector for some of this time, complained that the system made inspection work drudgery and created a dreary curriculum. So inspection could cause harm if done in the wrong ways. In the later 1800s, new political movements such as socialism emerged, and governments saw schools as part of the battle for influence. Inspectors were increasingly seen as an agent of government political policy, not just as people who checked the quality of schools. In the new Russian inspections of 1874, inspectors performed both pedagogical and police functions. The role of inspectors as spies for the government was revealed in the Revolution of 1905, but from 1911 they were actually paid extra to be spies. Of course, the most famous example of a school inspector from this period was Stalin's father. In Germany in 1891, the Kaiser said that teachers should teach the young to resist all revolutionary aims. Well, in Germany, the government became so worried about socialist teachers that it even became more friendly towards the churches. But then they discovered the problem of socialist inspectors infected with modern ideas about teaching. In 1912, a Prussian minister said inspectors should identify and dismiss Marxist teachers. Of course, all of them were civil servants. The same sort of thing happened elsewhere. In 1907 in Spain, for example, extra school inspectors were drafted into the Barcelona region to help manage the problem of leftists. Financial efficiency continued to be a factor driving inspection. Some school teachers in southern Italy were found to work only 3 hours a week. Efforts to link test scores with school finance, however, were gradually abandoned by 1914. The intention had been to strengthen weaker schools, but within a year of payment by results starting, it had been admitted that it has tended to discourage attention to the higher branches of elementary instruction, geography, grammar and history. So as early as 1867, an extra grant was offered for teaching these subjects to try to balance the curriculum. Effectively, the framework of inspection was being modified. In the same way, we can see that the framework in England in 2009 focused too much on just English and maths, and was then rebalanced by a new framework in 2019, which introduced different problems. Inspection frameworks also began to reflect new concerns in society. For example, the welfare and health of pupils became a focus, which in the early 1900s tended to be emphasised in connection with children being ready for military service. There was also a new growth in technical education, which required a new type of specialist inspector. Some systems also began to inspect nurseries, again requiring specialists and often providing a route into inspection work for women. Many of the early inspections still had a strong element of pass-fail mentality. During the later 1800s, it was still common for improvement to be influenced only through regulating the quality of teachers. The head teacher role was often very limited and poorly understood compared to now. For example, in Ireland, inspectors decided on issues of promotion and dismissal for teachers. They were managers as well as inspectors. Pass-fail regulatory inspections could not help adequate schools to improve and become better, even if levels of quality were defined, which they rarely were. Politicians did not always trust their inspectors to develop this sort of guidance, and actually they often didn't trust the teachers either. There was also very limited scientific literature on teaching and school management to inform the debate. Another thing, well, without detailed published reports about quality, schools could not learn from each other, though some inspectorates tried to make this possible through conferences. No one considered that reports might be for parents to read. However, in the later 1800s, some inspectorates began using a sequence of grades, and this helped to flag up who were the best schools that others could learn from. We've also seen that one of the first big changes in the European inspection workforce had been to establish that inspectors should generally be from a teaching background, not parish priests or other amateurs. Following that, There was then pressure for new types of school, including more secondary schools after about 1900, and the conventional inspectors did not have suitable expertise. So in time, specialist inspectors developed, and in some countries completely separate inspectorates developed to manage issues such as technical education. Schools began to expect that their inspectors would be genuine experts who would add value through inspection. As we draw to the end of this period of inspection, we should note some major questions that were developing. The teaching workforce had grown and changed, and in some countries like Germany, it was increasingly organised and vocal. Teachers began to criticise inspection practice, especially when new ideas about teaching had not been accepted by the inspectors. Governments also saw inspection as a tool to use against progressive teachers, but sometimes the inspectors were also progressive. The Russian framework included questions on the morals and politics of the teachers, but frameworks in most countries reflected political as well as educational views. These problems were to come to the fore in the 1930s. Well, thank you for watching this video. Look out for the next part of the story. You can also read a more detailed analysis in my book, which is available in print or ebook format anywhere in the world via Amazon. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and thanks for watching.